So the first thing he considers here, he asks whether God exists, or he makes a statement whether God exists, and what kind of God exists is surely one of the most fundamental issues addressed by any worldview, right? So last time we looked at the Christian worldview, and so this issue of the existence of God, he says, is one of the most fundamental issues, right? A foundational tenet of the Christian worldview is that God is real. Indeed, God is the ultimate reality, right? God is the absolute being above and behind all other beings. So in this chapter, what he's going to do here is consider some of the excellent reasons, he tells us, for believing that God is real. Right. And he's going to say it's not some vague, generic deity that he's going to look at, but the God of the Bible, right? The God that Jesus spoke about. So he's going to be relatively specific in terms of, not just theism in general, right? But the God of the Bible. Right. In fact, he's going to argue that if God isn't real, notice, nothing makes sense in this world. So that's kind of a heavy claim. Right. Yeah.
God shoulders a lot of weight. Yeah. We asked the question, can God be proven? And so this is talking about, can we slice off God's toenail? Can we look at it under a microscope? What does that do? Yeah. And for the Christian understanding, since we believe in a Trinity and an incarnation, that's entirely doable from that perspective. Yeah. Although not now, immediately. Right. Yeah. But there's work on the Shroud of Turin and all that jazz. But what we're kind of talking about here is kind of the Godhead in heaven. Can we prove that even remotely?
Right. In other words, can we prove the Christian God? Really is what he right. That's the question.
So we're not. So Dr. Jameson comes from the presuppositional track, and so it's not a generic deity, monotheistic deity, and then you add Jesus on top of it to kind of get Christianity. It starts from if the God of the Bible is true, what are the kind of implications for that?
Right. So, and if the God of the Bible isn't true, then what are the implications of that? Right. Kind of thing. Right.
So the way in which we might prove the existence of a thing will depend on the nature of the thing. Right. Kind of makes sense, right? So if you're trying to test for the visibility of air, well, that might be harder to do, at least.
Yeah, when I read this, it reminded me of Bonson's, the great debate where he talked about proving crackers in the cupboard was different than, there's a different way to prove whether crackers are in the cupboard as opposed to some other things, right? Yeah. You don't prove everything in the same way. Kind of thing, right?
That's why people need to be more read, so we get crackers in the cupboard type examples. So it depends on the nature of the thing, on what kind of thing it is. Yeah. So the God of the Bible is not at all like everything else. Indeed, according to Christianity, God is fundamentally and radically different from every other thing in existence. And we'll kind of cover that a little bit more as we unpack the chapter here. But unlike the deities of the Greek and Roman mythology, God isn't a being who exists within the universe as part of it. And so I've talked about that before. You have Zeus being hid, so his father doesn't eat him, but it still exists within this universe type thing. It's in an ether and the understanding of the makeup of the universe. Ether is this kind of element within the understanding that kind of has always existed. In fact, up until the development of the Big Bang, you had an idea of kind of a solid state universe of one that has always existed. And so the fact that skeptics now use Big Bang cosmology as a slight against deists of some kind is actually a strange position for them to take. And so God, we find God in the Bible, as we covered a couple episodes ago. He's there in the beginning, and then he creates. He's not there within some concept of Mount Olympus or
he's not part of the creation. He's separate from the creation.
He doesn't come out of the Nile and is divided up into 12 parts, and his mom doesn't pluck him out of a tree or something along those lines. He exists, and then there's the beginning of all of the existence that we know. So rather, God is a spiritual being who transcends both space and time. God isn't part of the universe because God created the universe. So he exists outside the universe, but that doesn't mean he can't enter into the universe. It doesn't mean that he has created and then, he just made something way too simple that even he can't communicate. Again, we're looking at this from what are the implications of the God of the Bible being true. And so these are the qualities.
And so since God is created the universe and he's not part of it, then Anderson tells us this means that we can't detect God in the way that we could, for instance, detect other things in the universe, right? Because he's not part of the universe. He's different, right?
And I like
he transcends the universe.
Right. I like our analogy of the computer program. The computer program can go out and search for errors. You have your debugging program, and then you have your that's your language, and then you have your program that actually does the task at hand. Well, that doesn't at all touch on who the creator of that computer program is, right. But the fact that they still exist.
Because the creator isn't part of the program, right? So we can't say, well, let's look at the program so that we can, get a piece of the creator's, what did you say, toenail, right?
Right, yeah. Just a small piece, the pinky toe. Yeah. So the computer program would be incorrect in saying that humans don't exist because it doesn't find it within the scope of its program.
Right.
But the intelligence that designed it has done it. The debugging program that kind of keeps everything in line and tells you when it can run, when it can't run, what to do, if-then statements. So you have a form of logic that enters into the computer program. But if it says, okay, now let me find a being of all ones and zeros, well, that doesn't happen because that being exists
only within,
para outside the computer.
And so we really can't detect God in the way that we could detect, toenail clipping. So how can then God's existence be proved if we can't detect him in what we would say the usual way, right? Well, he says, here's the answer. We have to, look at it in a different way. And so that's what he's going to unpack here for the rest of this chapter. So even though God cannot be directly perceived, like ordinary things within the universe, it turns out, he says, that we cannot make sense of the ordinary things that we do perceive in the universe as a whole, unless God exists. So that's the idea here, right? Unless God exists, we're not going to be able to make sense of anything else that we can perceive in the universe. So in short, only a worldview centered on a transcendent, perfect, personal creator can make rational sense of the very things that we take for granted all the time. Right. And so that's the approach that he's going to take, right? We can't detect God directly, but we can't make sense of all the things that we can detect directly unless God exists. Right. That's the idea.
And we did cover some of this in Nancy Piercy's Finding Truth one, so you can go back and watch those episodes. And also in Mitch Stokes' book, How to Be an Atheist, he talked about this idea of being careful of scientism, that this idea that science is the only way of establishing knowledge. Well, even good scientists will say, well, it doesn't really establish knowledge. It just establishes the best explanation for what we have at the time.
Right.
And so, Dr. Stokes talks about, being wary of saying the science says, scientists say, and here's the best scientific theory at the time.
Right.
And so you have the idea of like, oh, it's the God in the gaps and science has explained away these things. But you could just as easily say this is atheism, the gap, and this is just whatever's the placeholder, and it's assuming that atheism or some naturalistic explanation will explain away the thing in the end. So we have to be careful that of this idea that science is the only way of attaining knowledge, which that's not entirely true, because saying science is the only way of attaining knowledge, how do you scientifically determine that? Et cetera. So,
we got it. That gets us into a problem, right?
Yeah. So there won't be.
That's a philosophical statement about science. It's not a scientific statement, and therefore we can't prove it in the way we would a scientific statement, right? And so if you say the science is the only way to knowledge, well, that statement can't be proven. So it's kind of defeats itself. Right. Oops.
Right. So it's internally inconsistent, and so it fails.